The National Forest is in fact one of the largest sustainable development projects in the UK, if not in Europe. It covers 200 square miles, parts of Leicestershire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire. It's about tree planting, basically to take woodland cover up from 6% to around a third. But in doing so, in changing the landscape, it's about linking all sorts of environmental, economic and social objectives. The National Forest is essentially about landscape change, about tree planting, but that in itself means that there's a truly integrated aspect to the project and a whole set of multiple objectives. So in changing the landscape, we're dealing with derelict land and reclamation needs. There was a very extensive derelict area in the former coalfield. We're looking at improving biodiversity, looking at improving public access, providing a framework for tourism and visitor development, looking at also providing a better environment for inward investment and economic development. Now all those are either physical or economic things, but the social side is very important as well. Getting 200,000 people that live in the forest involved in it, and also providing opportunities for the many millions of people who live around the National Forest to get involved and to enjoy what's being created. The National Forest was born in the 1980s. You may think the 1980s was really about shoulder pads, glam rock, new romantics, but it was also really about a dissatisfaction with what was going on with the landscape in the UK. In particular, forestry had got itself rather a bad reputation. There was a lot of plantation forestry being done in rather sensitive landscapes, particularly in the uplands. And the sort of opposition to that was also fueled by the fact that fairly rich people, a lot of celebrities, were getting tax breaks to do this plantation forestry. Now the then Countryside Commission in 1987 actually published a sort of prospectus for what lowland forestry could do for the country, a bit in the what have the Romans done for us sort of thing. And they proposed in that document that there should be an experiment, the creation of a new national forest in the Midlands that would tackle landscape change, but it would show that forestry could be done on an extensive scale, but sensitively, and bring about a lot of benefits for people. So that then led to a sort of competition between 5 or 6 areas between, I think, 1989 and 1991 to put themselves forward to host the new National Forest. The areas that did put themselves forward were Rockingham in Northamptonshire, Arden in Warwickshire, Mercia in South Staffordshire, Sherwood in North Derbyshire and North Nottinghamshire, and the National Forest centred on Leicestershire and South Derbyshire and just extending into East Staffordshire. Now the hot favourite at the time was Sherwood. In fact, I worked in Nottinghamshire at that time, and there was a lot of confidence that the Sherwood brand would be what won the National Forest. But in 1991 a decision was made that it should actually be located in Leicestershire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire. That was for 3 reasons. One was very low rates of tree cover, 6% overall, which was the equivalent of about 1% in the non-wooded areas in the middle. An outstanding need for landscape regeneration because there was a lot of derelict land there. A lot of unemployment as a result of manufacturing change in Burton-on-Trent and the decline of the coalfield in Derbyshire and Leicestershire. They were all, if you like, negative factors, but there's a really strong positive factor, and it's probably that led to the area being chosen. And that positive factor was that in Leicestershire in particular, there was a big sort of public campaign. I think it was thumbs up from the National Forest saying, we want to host this, we'll work with you and we'll make it happen. And that perhaps was a bit more exciting than what might have been noted as a bit of complacency on behalf of one or two of the others. So the decision was made in 1991. There was then a sort of formative planning period between 1991 and 1995. In 1995, the organisation I work for, the National Forest Company, was established. It's a company that's limited by guarantee, but it's a quango, and it's set up very much in the way that the regional development agencies are. By that time, the search area had been reduced from 400 square miles down to a 200 square mile boundary. That 200 square mile boundary uses the template of the New Forest or the Forest of Dean, which are of similar size, and it's about the maximum that the then government said they would risk and be prepared to fund. And basically it was there was some planting done before 1995, but it was all systems go from that point. The National Forest is funded directly by the government. The Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs is our main shareholder. Subject to annual planning and annual performance, which is fairly rigorous, we get what's called a grant in aid settlement. That grant in aid settlement is currently around about £3.6 million. It's varied in the past from £2.5 million up to about £3.8 million. Government has signed up to the current level of funding we anticipate for the next 5 years or so. Now what that does is that enables us to run a dedicated team that's all about creating and fulfilling the National Forest, and to run a variety of small grant programmes and revenue programmes. That costs us in total about £1 million each year. It leaves us about £2.5 million a year to spend on forest creation and major projects. The majority of the money that we spend actually goes on grants to private landowners and on land acquisition and site development. And we created the forest for the first 10 years or so at a rate of about 500 hectares a year. That represents 1% of forest cover. Our revised target for the next 4 or 5 years is 200 to 250 hectares a year. But at the same time, we've got to focus on bringing a number of other major projects forward. In addition to that core funding, we are encouraged to get funding for projects from elsewhere. So basically, we work in partnership with the regional development agencies, lottery funds, landfill tax credits organisations, and we've also got quite a good track record of engaging the private sector. So various projects in the forest have been funded by Rolls-Royce, Toyota, Severn Trent, Jaguar, Lloyds TSB Auto Lease. We've got quite an impressive list of blue chip sponsors, although of course in the current economic situation that's a little tight now. The National Forest is progressing really well. There's over 7 million new trees have been planted. That adds to the 3 million or so that were already there in the more wooded parts of the forest when we began. Those 7 million or so new trees represent about 12% of landscape cover. So it means we're well over halfway towards our target of a third woodland cover. So we've gone up from 6% to 18%. We also need to look at that in the context of the other benefits that have come along. So the forest has led to a lot more public access being created. Around 80% of the sites that we funded have full informal public access. There's a lot of work that's been done on biodiversity and conservation, so there's a whole set of new habitats being created for target species like otters, redstarts, bluebells, ruddy-darted dragonflies, and some tree species like black poplar. People have been engaged as well. We believe there's about 40,000 or so adults and children who have been engaged in the forest throughout its process. Money, that's always interesting. The National Forest Company has probably received and spent over the time of between 30 to 40 million pounds of direct funding. But we believe that's levered in at least another 60 million pounds of regeneration funding from other pots. And with that, forest visitor centres have been developed. There's been work on town centres, work on deprived neighbourhoods, work specifically on visitor infrastructure, trails and the like. So pretty impressive in terms of landscape change, but that's integrated along with the economic and social aspects of the area as well. National Forest Company starts really at the bottom there, I guess, using the principle of local action, and we're very careful about the way in which we use resources as a team. There are only 20 of us that work for the National Forest Company. We do a lot of stuff to minimise our own carbon footprint. However, you need to do a lot more than that. I guess we could sit back and say, because of all this wonderful landscape change, because of all the stuff that's been done with biodiversity and nature conservation, we don't need to do anything. But we strive to ensure that when sites are being developed, they, as a bottom line, follow national good practice in terms of land management. I can perhaps get on to talk about climate change a little bit later, but there's some quite interesting stuff going on there about what we're doing. One of the key challenges we have, having developed a visitor economy which sees about 7 or 8 million people a year visiting the forest, bringing with them a lot of money, is the fact, of course, that how do they get there and how do they move around once they're in the forest. Transport issues in the forest are quite complex. If you look at the geography of the area, we're influenced quite heavily by movement patterns and transport infrastructure that serves Derby, Nottingham, Loughborough, Leicester, Coventry and Birmingham. So what's tending to happen is that the transport opportunities pull outwards rather than push inwards. And the nature of the forest as a visitor destination is that most people go there for day visits or for limited short breaks. So it's almost inevitable that the majority of visits will be made by car. So what we're looking to do is to perhaps accept that, but then when we've got people in the forest is to try to ensure that we can give them choices that mean that they don't have to drive all over the place, or indeed that they can make linked journeys. So we've worked quite extensively as the landscape has developed to invest in overnight accommodation. Got some flagship projects like a 90-bed camping and caravan club site, an 82-bedroom youth hostel, forestry lodges, and a whole lot of stuff that the private sector is doing as well. And if we can encourage more overnight guests, then we can get people to do more integrated visits. We are looking at signage and tourism information that explains to people exactly what they can do, where they can do it, opening times, how they can do combined visits. We've put quite a lot of investment into walking trails and cycling trails. I think that's quite a long-term project. We have got an aspiration actually for a National Forest long distance trail that we hope will come into being by about 2012, 2013. And it means that people can walk through the forest, they can access it from the nearby urban centres, much in the same way that people would use the Forest of Dean Way, the Cotswold Way or something like that. Partnerships and the local government structure is really quite interesting as far as transport is concerned, because we've got to try and engage with the process that's going on in 3 or 4 transport planning areas. And we're doing that. We've got the National Forest written into various local transport plans, and we have a platform for investment agreed with Derbyshire, Leicestershire and Staffordshire in particular about greenways. We are, however, looking over the next 12 months or so to try to put together a scoping document for a new sustainable transport strategy for the forest as a whole. It would be lovely to think we might do some really radical things in there. The perhaps most radical and most attractive being reopening the railway line between Burton-on-Trent and Leicester to passenger traffic. However, I think we recognise that practically, our organisation is not in a position to do that. We can wave the flag for those sort of major infrastructure investments, but we really need to work perhaps more at a local level. So I think we'll be looking there at joint ticketing arrangements, we'll be looking at targeting public transport operators, excursion operators, and flagging up to them that they can be part of our sustainable tourism offer. So, for example, you ought to be able to get leisure buses from Derby in much the same way that you can get the Trans Peak from Derby that goes up around and through the Peak District. We'll be looking at that sort of thing. But it is a challenge, and also to a certain extent we don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and 7 million visitors a year is a pretty significant goose and a pretty significant egg, and it's that holds the key towards the economic prosperity of the area. So we've got to work with the grain of what's going on, I think, as well. Well, perhaps as far as the National Forest is concerned, we use a tourism strapline, the National Forest and beyond. So I'll answer this question about Conkers and beyond. So if we start with Conkers, that's the National Forest Visitor Centre, the principal attraction in the heart of the forest. It was designed to be sustainable. It's sustainable really because it sits on the site of 2 previous deep mines which closed in the mid-1990s. Its development led to the reclamation of that site. And it's created new employment in an area that needed it with a sustainable tourism theme. The building itself features ground source heating for water. It's a lot of wood has been used in the construction, and it's also built to fairly high standards in terms of insulation and temperature control. It's a very striking building as well, and it's a sort of inside and outside building. If it were built now, it could be better in terms of its environmental performance. We would aim for what's called a BREEAM excellent rating. That didn't exist when we put it together. But the forest isn't just about Conkers. We do have an award-winning youth hostel that's been developed quite close to Conkers that's run regional awards through the RICS and the Construction Industries Council for sustainability. And that particular building, as well as it allowing people to come and stay in the forest, which is good from a sustainable tourism point of view, and as well as engaging young people and school groups in environmental tourism, the building itself actually has many qualities. It's built out of wood, it has a timber frame, it has larch cladding on the outside, it is heated by solar panels and a wood chip heating system. It features passive ventilation rather than air conditioning. It also has rainwater capture and reuse for toilet flushes and that sort of thing. And it's been recognised as being a bit of a flagship for the National Forest Company, for the National Forest and for the Youth Hostel Association. We hope to go one stage further than that though quite soon with more developments at Roslyston Forestry Centre. Roslyston Forestry Centre in South Derbyshire has a district heating scheme there that works off wood chips, and we're just about to embark on a development of small craft workshops which we think will have a BM excellent rating. They'll be constructed from a timber frame, they'll have walls that are made from hempcrete, they will feature wood fuel heating, green roofs, grey water recycling, the whole suite of what makes a good sustainable building. There's always a need though to be a little bit pragmatic here as well, and one perhaps needs to look at what happened to the Earth Centre in Doncaster, which was probably a really good concept, a really good building, but perhaps one that was in the wrong place, and perhaps it had too serious a message. So, whilst Conkers wants to be seen as being sustainable, it also needs to be a fun place to go, because for it to be viable, it needs to attract over 200,000 people a year. The National Forest Company itself sets quite a lot of store by by setting a good example. As I've said before, we're a relatively small organisation, but we do look very carefully at procurement of goods. We look carefully at recycling of material. We actually do things like reusing our waste paper for note-taking and so on in the office before it's shredded and recycled. We've introduced a policy about trying to look at positive conscious decisions on transport, sharing lifts to work, sharing journeys to sites and meetings and so on. But to be quite honest, what you can do with the impact of 20 people is not that significant. What the forest has done though, it's provided a platform really for the 9 local authorities in the area, for the many other organisations and businesses who are engaged in the forest to think seriously about sustainability, to think seriously about waste management. Indeed, in Swadlincote and in Burton-on-Trent there are some specific business, energy and waste programmes going on which have probably been funded because they are in the forest. So we think we've engaged hearts and minds there. We know we've engaged hearts and minds with local people because they want to be part of the forest, they want their sites to look good, and they want to think that they're part of a different sort of community really that is looking forward to the future and thinking about resource management and waste minimisation. However, 200,000 people and 7 million visitors do inevitably generate waste material. There is not a forest-wide policy on how people should dispose of waste when they visit. Various organisations, the National Trust, the Woodland Trust, the Forestry Commission, will have their own practices which come into play. I think basically our message would be for people to minimise waste through their own behaviour. Perhaps not to bring too much with them into the forest, to leave as little as possible. I think there are good recycling opportunities where most people live, so wherever possible they can take the stuff home with them, I think. The trees, as they grow, will create waste. The tree guards and things that are used around them are biodegradable, but they'll need a certain sort of management. We're encouraging good management of woodlands. As the woodlands grow up, there'll be quite a lot of pruning and thinning that goes on. We would be looking to use the majority of that material for wood fuel, for wood chips and so on, which means there's a sort of virtuous circle in terms of the trees that you don't need because they were there as nurse species or they're growing up can actually fulfill a good carbon neutral function. Climate change is something which is going to affect us all, and it will affect the forest as it goes into the future. I think we've got to be careful to try and plan for what might happen. So we need to make sure that we've created a robust and resilient landscape. I'll come back to that point in a minute, because what I haven't said, possibly what people were expecting me to say, is, oh, we've planted 7.5 million new trees, that means we're sequestering so many tonnes of carbon a week that it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, actually. We have got a climate change and a carbon statement on our website. In that we say that planting and managing woodlands is undoubtedly good for the environment. It is one way of addressing climate change, that some carbon will be sequestered or taken up. But we don't want to sell the forest based on the fact it's a carbon sink or a place where sequestration will occur. We want to be much more positive than that. We want people to recognise that through landscape change and good landscape management, we can re-engage with the environment and help it to cope with change. In terms of what we do specifically, we know that tree planting, as opposed to arable farming, decreases runoff. It will help to deal with flood incidents better. We also are encouraging a mix of tree species. There will be some sites where we want to do very local provenance, which is almost seed collection from sites next door, because that's the right thing to do. But we're also encouraging people where they're looking at the majority of new woodlands to use a mix of stock, including stock from down towards the South Midlands and the south of England. We've always been open to experimentation, always been open to using the exemplar role of the National Forest to look at how particular tree species might perform in particular situations. So we've got a number of demonstration plots and trial plots going on with particular species about growth rates and how they cope in what's currently the limits of their sort of environmental tolerance, which could become a better environment for them. We've got a particularly interesting emphasis on landscape connectivity. So that's thinking about when species do want to migrate, and I don't mean a big panic where they rush from one part of the Midlands to the other, but steadily where species will wish to migrate. Have they got the landscape corridors to do so? Now, to date, most of the planting that's been done in the National Forest has been large-scale, opportunistic. One of the really interesting things we're doing over the next few years is to be targeting connectivity planting, creating corridors that link woodland areas and link different habitats. So it will give this this framework, really, that the different species can use to move about and to allow themselves to adapt to climate change. In the forest, species choice is going to be important about what goes on particular sites. However, there will also be a need for a fairly broad palette of choices. We are doing some specific work on the possibility of fuel crops coming in from species like eucalyptus. We're also looking at fast-growing species like sycamore and birch and willow, not short rotation coppice, but normal willow trees for wood fuel, and that's really part of climate change adaptation. We are encouraging people, as we have done before, to be innovative, and if, for example, people wish to bring in an appropriate landscape tests of European oak, different densities, we'd be quite happy. We do need to be careful, though, that we don't go down the route of inappropriate species choice and introducing something that's alien in an irresponsible way. So I think our approach is we want to use sound science in a responsible way, but we'd also like people to be able to innovate and test and push the boundaries. The future for the National Forest is pretty long term actually, because it will be about 100 years before the project's completed. Whether or not the National Forest Company will be around at that time I think is debatable, so we're working more in bite-sized chunks at the moment. But one of the things we've got to do is try to create a legacy for the future, try to create a framework for those people and organisations that follow on so they can get the best out of the forest. But the first bite-sized chunk we're dealing with really is 2009 to 2014. And we've just agreed, after fairly widespread consultation, a new delivery plan for the National Forest over the next 5 years. That's been signed off by government and also signed off by our partners and local communities. And essentially we've got a 5-point plan there. One is we're going to keep creating the forest, albeit at a slower rate. We'll be looking at 200 to 250 hectares a year, and we'll be balancing the way in which we go in for larger scale opportunistic planting with this finely tuned targeted approach to look at critical connections in the landscape. We planted a lot of trees. There's 10 million trees in the forest now, old and new. Trees are a bit like children and then teenagers. They're particularly difficult when they get into their teenage years because they sort of grow and get rather knotty and get tangled up in each other and can look a bit messy and untidy. And unless you manage them carefully, they don't fulfil their potential. So we've really got to try and switch all our woodland owners onto the need for good woodland management over the next 10 to 15 years, so that they get these teenage woods out into their young, flourishing adulthood, where they can look forward to a long and prosperous life, maybe. So that's the theme of making the most of what we've created. The people in the forest do remain critical to us. They've, if you like, gone along with us while we've tampered large scale with their landscape. We've presented them with new opportunities, but as I've said before, some of the opportunities, the visitors, actually create challenges in terms of transport needs. So we want to keep working with people. And what we've been told is they would like to see us communicate even better with them about what's going on, and they'd like us to try to work with individual towns and villages to see how they can get involved in their bit of the forest. So we're looking at piloting some quite interesting community involvement stuff there. And of course we do want, well, Derby in particular actually, and Leicester, which are the two communities closest to the forest, we want to see it as their recreational opportunity on the doorstep. We want it to be seen in the same way as the Peak District. We've got a challenge as well with communities in that there's a need for new housing in the forest, and we need to try and weave new development in so we get high design standards, but we get vibrant new communities, but we get something that fits the forest, and green infrastructure is going to be important in that. Telling the story is something I'm doing today about the forest, but again that's important to us. Communicating what's happening, communicating the fact it's a long-term project, and communicating at all levels, sharing experience, giving others the benefit of our experience, but also recognising that there's a lot of other projects around the country that we can learn from. So telling the story and communicating is important. And then finally, the fifth point is to celebrate what's been done so far and celebrate what's going to happen by being seen as a national showcase. So, you know, we want to be the place where the best sustainable buildings are put up. We want to be the place where there is some genuinely innovative work about climate change.